Good evening, everyone. I think Center Presents will start. People may continue to come in, but we're going to start. Center Presents is very happy that we're starting our programs again in 2021. I just would like to tell you that in February 17th, there'll be another virtual presentation by Sophie Usherwood. She's a senior at Hanover High School and she teaches origami. And the title of her presentation is The Art of Folding Paper and Therapeutic Meditation. And Sophie will be limiting the participants because she will actually be helping people online and showing them how to do their work. Then on March 10th, there's another virtual presentation. Anne McClellan, who's the interim provost at Plymouth State College, and a professor of British literature will be giving a Center Presents program entitled Not So Elementary, My Dear Watson, the popularity of Sherlock Holmes. So if you are interested in either of those, please watch highlights for when our programs will start. Also, tonight, I'd like to ask everyone to put their laptop on mute so there won't be any distractions to our speaker. And also, when we start, you'd probably be better putting it on speaker view so Tom will be your main focus as you're watching this. We will have questions afterward, and you can write those questions in the chat section at the bottom of your laptop. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Tom Hull. Tom has lived in Eastman since 1978, I guess, with his wife Jill. And he served in the Foreign Service for just about 34 years and retired as ambassador to Sierra Leone. And he has a master's degree in international education and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. So, Tom, you can start.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to all of you who are joining this evening. I look forward to discussing with you any questions or comments that you may have following my presentation. I hope that in the course of my remarks, I will have anticipated most of them. Last February, I was scheduled to give an Eastman Presents talk entitled Demystifying Diplomacy in response to questions neighbors asked me about the Foreign Service after viewing the impeachment testimony of Ambassadors Yovanovitch and Taylor and other Foreign Service officers. People unfamiliar with the Foreign Service are understandably curious and sometimes confused. They have been known to ask us, how did you end up in the Foreign Legion? When we say, no, that's the Foreign Service, they occasionally respond, you mean the Forestry Service? Clearly, the Foreign Service remains a mystery for most people. So a year later, the topic is still relevant with some adjustments reflecting new realities. As you may have gleaned from the impeachment hearings and more recent confirmation hearings, the Foreign Service is a key element in American diplomacy. And as my title, Resurrecting American Diplomacy, suggests, it is in crisis. Diplomacy is both an art and a profession. As an art, it has been described as the ability to handle a porcupine without disturbing the quills. As interesting as that may be for discussion, my focus this evening is on the professionals who perform that art, the diplomats of the Foreign Service, who are the primary instrument of American foreign policy. As our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, recently said, he is the face of American diplomacy, and Foreign Service professionals are its soul. I'm going to explain the principles under which the Foreign Service operates, its role in our national security, its background, the challenges that it faces, and possible remedies to make it more effective in the creation and conduct of our foreign policies. In that context, I want to underscore that my presentation is not intended to be about specific foreign policies, politics, or personalities, although some nonpartisan discussion of these will be unavoidable since the Foreign Service is an element of the US government. Diplomacy is part of a national security triad that also depends on our military and our intelligence community. This has long been the case. When President Theodore Roosevelt said that we should walk softly and carry a big stick, he was referring to diplomacy as the soft power and the military as our club. Our national security requires that we not only be attentive to what is happening everywhere in the world, but also anticipate and be engaged wherever our national interests are affected. This is the job of diplomacy, which may have a glamorous connotation based on news reports of summit meetings and state dinners. Those types of events are usually the culmination of months of unglamorous behind-the-scenes substantive preparation by Foreign Service officers. Even less visible is the everyday work of our diplomats, such as the repatriation last year of 100,000 Americans stranded around the world as foreign governments impose travel restrictions and as commercial airlines shut down due to COVID-19. The low profile that the Foreign Service embraces explains much of the mystification of what diplomacy is and does. To give you some context, diplomacy as a key element of our national security dates back to the American Revolution, when Benjamin Franklin in France and John Adams in Holland established alliances that enlisted the financial and material aid necessary for our military to succeed. Thus began the long relationship among diplomacy and defense and economic strength and the use of alliances as fundamental to our national security. Article 2 of our Constitution gives the President the authority to conduct the foreign affairs of our country, including the appointment of the Secretary of State and ambassadors with the advice and consent of the Senate. Throughout the 19th century, American diplomats were inexperienced political supplicants for the most part, who received their appointments through patronage. While many of these were quite effective in negotiating commercial treaties on America's behalf, many more used them as sinecures to line their pockets. The risks of this system became apparent when President Garfield was assassinated in 1881 by an unsuccessful supplicant for a diplomatic position in Europe. At the turn of the century, President Theodore Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay recognized that America's expanding global role would require the expertise and continuity of professional diplomats to assist our political leaders. Thus, they began a gradual transformation that culminated in Congress passing the Rogers Act in 1926 to establish the Foreign Service. This was superseded by the Foreign Service Act of 1946 and the current Foreign Service Act of 1980, which affirmed, and I quote, that a career foreign service characterized by excellence and professionalism is essential to the national interest to assist the President and the Secretary of State in conducting the foreign affairs of the United States. At the core of our diplomatic service are foreign service officers who are required to be trustworthy, objective, faithful to our Constitution and laws, and non-political in accordance with the Hatch Act. To quote from an article published 2 months ago by President Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, who is now 100 years old, the personal qualities of integrity, empathy, problem-solving attitudes, and the ability to build trusting relationships are critical to success as a diplomat. Traits like these, plus courage, determination, and patriotism, are what made Marie Yovanovitch such an effective ambassador to Ukraine, said George Shultz. Ambassador Yovanovitch, at the first impeachment hearing, spoke for all Foreign Service officers when she said, "Let me be clear about who we are and how we serve this country. We are professionals, public servants who by vocation and training pursue the policies of the President, regardless of who holds that office or what party they are affiliated with. And we make a difference every day. We are people who repeatedly uproot our lives, who risk and sometimes give our lives for the country. We understand the call of duty to advance and protect the interests of the United States. We take our oath seriously to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. I count myself lucky to be a Foreign Service officer, fortunate to serve with the best America has to offer, blessed to serve the American people," end quote. There are currently just under 8,000 Foreign Service officers in the State Department. They are supported by nearly 6,000 Foreign Service specialists, such as security officers, personnel officers, property maintenance officers, and IT specialists, and office managers. If these 14,000 employees seem large, consider that former Secretary of Defense Gates once observed that there are more musicians in military bands than diplomats in the Foreign Service. In fact, the Foreign Service today is at its smallest number since 2016. Becoming a Foreign Service officer is a highly competitive process that often takes a year and a half or longer. The Foreign Service Act requires that employment be on the basis of, and I quote, "an impartial and rigorous examination." The process begins with a written exam that roughly 10,000 applicants take annually, of whom 20% pass. This is followed by an intensive oral assessment and other exams, such as for foreign language potential. In the end, then after they do that, they also have to obtain security and medical clearances for worldwide availability. In the end, the State Department hires 300 new Foreign Service officers annually, or approximately 3% of those who began the process. There is criticism of this process as anachronistic, particularly in not producing a representative workforce that America needs to represent itself to the world. The length of the process is also an issue because many fine candidates are snatched more quickly by the private sector. The Foreign Service has been described humorously as male, Pale, and Yale. But there is some truth to this barb. Gender balance has increased considerably since the 1970s, as Ambassador Jovanovic personified. But still, 60% of Foreign Service officers are male. Racial diversification is a greater challenge and a major focus of the Biden administration. The Foreign Service Act requires it to, and I quote, be representative of the American people, end quote, and to vigorously foster, and I quote again, entry into and advancement in the Foreign Service by persons from all segments of American society, end quote. At present, the Foreign Service is 80% white, and in the senior ranks, 88% white, which is far short of where it should be. There are several programs, such as internships created by Congress to attract minority youth to the Foreign Service, and there are certain to be many more. Educationally, most Foreign Service officers have graduate degrees in a wide range of disciplines. Secretary of State Pompeo complained that too many Foreign Service officers had been educated in the Boston to Washington corridor, and urged them or be recruited elsewhere with the cultural values that he acquired in Kansas. In my career, I had colleagues who were educated throughout the country, but statistics show that universities in the District of Columbia, East Coast states, the Upper Midwest, do produce the most Foreign Service officers. Age, depending on how old you are, is no obstacle to joining the Foreign Service. Anyone between the ages of 20 and 60 can take the Foreign Service exam. Relatively few people go directly from college into the Foreign Service, since the selection process values graduate education and professional and overseas experience. The motivation for an older applicant might be as simple as a desire for a career change, but 59 is the maximum employment age because 65 is the mandatory retirement age. I once had someone who was 59, just joined the Foreign Service, working for me after a long career with ExxonMobil. And he was just looking forward to a good way to end his career. The Foreign Service, unlike the military, unlike the civil service, but like the military, is merit-based. It's an up or out system in which officers must be promoted within specific timeframes or be selected out. They cannot take more than 27 years to reach the senior Foreign Service, which by law requires, and I quote, strong foreign policy formulation capabilities, outstanding executive leadership qualities, and highly developed functional foreign language and area expertise. In this pyramid structure, fewer than 5% of officers are promoted into the senior ranks, which equate to more, which equate in military terms to protocol ranks equivalent to brigadier to 4-star general. Officers are not allowed more than 35 years in service unless they have a presidential appointment, such as an ambassadorship. This system is designed to create a constant flow of the best officers, but that can be seriously disrupted by hiring freezes, as happened during the Reagan and Clinton administrations and in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. When hiring resumes, the larger than normal intake of new officers creates what is known as the bulge in the python by blocking the path of officers who might have been promoted normally. Separating unpromoted officers might facilitate the flow, but it wastes the talent, skills, and experience of Foreign Service experts in whom the American taxpayer has made a significant investment. Similarly, when the Trump presidency began, there were large-scale forced resignations and early retirements, particularly at the senior levels, which deprived the Foreign Service of seasoned diplomats to develop and to implement our foreign policies and to mentor more junior levels. So what do Foreign Service officers do, and where do they serve? The department's Foreign Service officers are divided into 5 separate cones or specializations: political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, and management. These officers ideally spend about 2/3 of their careers overseas. This varies by circumstances and preferences. For example, by choice, I spent 80% of my career overseas. The duration of an assignment in any one country is determined by factors such as danger, hardship, and family circumstances. For example, an assignment in Afghanistan might be 1 year without family, and in Australia, 4 years with family. The portion of the Foreign Service serving in the United States, normally in the State Department's geographic offices, such as Western Europe or East Asia, in functional sections such as policy planning, congressional relations, or American Citizen Services, in thematic divisions such as political, military affairs, economic affairs, or public diplomacy, and in management offices such as human resources, diplomatic security, or information technology. Recently, a disproportionate number of officers have been assigned to Washington, and there have been complaints of too few overseas opportunities necessary for promotion. In theory, an officer cannot spend more than 5 consecutive years in Washington, but there are many exceptions. A very small portion of those in Washington are in long-term training, such as foreign language study. Overall, Foreign Service, in-service training opportunities, especially for tradecraft, have been too few. When Colin Powell was Secretary of State, he noted that he had spent 7 of his 35 years in the military in education and training, and he tried to expand training opportunities for the Foreign Service. A lack of resources blocked his efforts. As an Inspector General report on training last year critically stated, and I quote it, "Successful American diplomats are people you can throw into the deep end of the pool with the confidence that they won't drown, but nobody ever taught them to swim." The Foreign Service officers overseas are spread thinly across 276 overseas posts, mainly embassies and consulates. China is the only country with a comparable number. I will not go into great detail on how our diplomatic missions are structured in terms of the division of responsibilities among the various Foreign Service specializations, partly because no 2 embassies have exactly the same size or structure. These are determined by factors such as the complexity and importance of our relationship with the host country and the need for services for American citizens. The State Department is the primary entity in every embassy and consulate overseas. There are others in most embassies, such as the United States Agency for International Development and the Departments of Commerce and Agriculture, which have distinct branches of the Foreign Service, but they are not my focus this evening. Likewise, there are usually non-Foreign Service representatives in an embassy, such as Defense Department military attachés and FBI legal attachés. Embassies and consulates are structures that symbolize our country. But most of our most effective diplomacy takes place outside their walls. Most countries have relationship-based societies that require diplomats to engage face-to-face with foreign contacts and publics to serve our national interests most effectively. As former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has said, the essence of diplomacy is to build relationships. It is essential for diplomacy to deal with people before you need them so that they have faith in you and what you're saying when you do need them. However, this has become a challenge for American diplomacy because of the domestic political consequences of our embassies and diplomats being attacked abroad, which has made Washington politicians more risk averse. Following the 1998 bombing in East Africa, Congress appropriated $21 billion to fortify our diplomatic facilities worldwide. This has made them intimidating and less accessible to foreigners. Likewise, the 2011 killing of Ambassador Stevens in Libya led to severe restrictions on the movements of our diplomats outside our embassies and consulates. Foreign service officers generally dislike precautions that go beyond prudence because isolation impedes diplomacy. They fear that in too many places, the security tail has been wagging the diplomatic dog. This relates to the larger problem in the title of my talk, Resurrecting American Diplomacy, which implies that our diplomacy has been in decline. In 1991, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, the United States was at the pinnacle of its power and influence, and widely admired and respected. Since then, our stature has diminished substantially, although we remain a pivotal power in the world. This larger issue has been the subject of many books and articles. If you want to explore this history in detail, you can find a thoughtful analysis at our Dunbar Library in a recent book by a retired Boston University professor and Army Colonel, Andrew Bacevich, entitled The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. My point is that the decline in our stature has been accompanied by a reduction in our diplomatic capacity at a time when the changing political environment brought new threats to our country, threats that our country did not adequately anticipate. In that respect, please bear with me for a few minutes while I broadly review some pertinent history to bring us up to the present. At the end of the Cold War, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, Secretary of State James Baker was offered congressional funding to cover the costs of opening 20 new embassies in the successor countries. He declined, claiming that the State Department, he declined imprudently claiming that the State Department could cover the costs of the new establishments. Under President Clinton, Secretary of State Warren Christopher championed what he called a tough budget for tough times. In 1994, when the Republicans took control of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chairman Jesse Helms took an axe to the foreign operations budget that reduced overall diplomatic funding by 30% over the course of the 1990s and wiped out the U.S. Information Agency, where I worked, and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in 1998. At that point, our so-called Cold War peace dividend was totally gone. After September 11, 2001, when President Bush needed diplomats to develop support for the global war on terrorism, he discovered that the State Department was 20% understaffed and severely under-resourced. Secretary of State Colin Powell was able to get some support from new counterterrorism funding, but he and the Foreign Service were mostly marginalized by Vice President Cheney and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld in what was known as the militarization of diplomacy. Hundreds of diplomatic positions and substantial funds were redirected to Iraq and Afghanistan. And ambassadors elsewhere, myself included, no longer had sufficient resources to support democratization and human rights programs and other foreign policy initiatives unless they could creatively repackage them as counterterrorism. Foreign policy formulation shifted from the State Department to the Vice President's office, thereby diminishing the input of Foreign Service officers at the time, and even excluding Secretary Powell on some major decisions. When President Obama took over in 2009, there was hope that the decline of the State Department would be reversed when he declared, and I quote him, "Events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy and to build consensus to solve our problems whenever possible." However, at the time of his reelection in 2012, 28% of Foreign Service positions were still vacant or filled by below-level employees, including many borrowed from the civil service. With insufficient resources for diplomacy, our first line of defense was the weakest link in the national security triad. As General Mattis testified to Congress at the time, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more bullets. The more we put into the State Department budget, the less we have to put into the military budget." With the turnover of presidential administrations, some distrust of the Foreign Service is normal, even now. As a colleague of mine wrote in an article in 1998, "Our work is little understood and therefore distrusted by both political parties, each of which sees us as being in league with the other. Normally, this distrust dissipates and a partnership forms when political appointees realize that the professionals truly are nonpartisan and prepared to help formulate and implement the foreign policy of the new president. In return, Foreign Service officers expect the full support of the president they serve." Under President Trump, who was the first president to have no previous experience in government or in the military, the partnership never formed. His belief in a deep state intent on thwarting him led him to see the Foreign Service as an enemy to be circumvented rather than as a potential ally. When Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who also had no prior government experience, arrived at Foggy Bottom, the home of the State Department, his first act was to begin dismantling the State Department by removing the most senior Foreign Service officers and emptying offices without replacing anyone. He imposed a hiring freeze and advocated a budget that would have reduced the State Department by 27% and eliminated 1,300 positions. Former Secretary Kissinger said at the time, "I am certainly uncomfortable with the fact that one can walk through the State Department and find so many offices empty." Former Secretary Schultz dismissively commented, "You don't start with the idea that you are going to cut everything before you know what's going on. Former Secretary Powell accused Tillerson of, quote, ripping the guts out of the organization, end quote. Tillerson promised a plan that never materialized. After his departure, a State Department employee told Washingtonian magazine, we're still reeling from the big reorganization that he was supposed to do, but never happened. It's like he broke all the eggs, but never made the omelet. Tillerson's time at State was short, but not because of the proposed budget that failed in Congress, but because he stood up to President Trump on major issues such as weakening our alliances. If there was any doubt about Trump himself wanting to cut the Foreign Service, he made himself clear in 2017 by his reaction when Vladimir Putin expelled hundreds of American embassy staff from Russia. Instead of defending his Americans, President Trump said, I am very thankful that he let go a large number of people because now we have a smaller payroll. We'll save a lot of money. In fact, during his presidency, President Trump outdid Tillerson's proposal by reducing the number of Foreign Service officers by 1,500, further weakening our diplomatic strength. When Mike Pompeo became Secretary of State, many in the Foreign Service hoped his close relationship with the president would improve conditions. This optimism dissipated on Pompeo's first day on the job, when he pledged to transform the State Department into the Department of Swagger. Since swagger has never been a characteristic of the Foreign Service culture, this pledge backfired spectacularly. Fears at State Department were confirmed when the second Trump budget submission to Congress called for a 30% budget cut, which even Republican Senator Lindsey Graham declared dead on arrival before it was delivered. Congress protected the State Department from the most draconian budget cuts, but the Foreign Service continued to atrophy. After the White House characterized the impeachment testimony of Foreign Service witnesses as, quote, a coordinated smear campaign by unelected bureaucrats waging war on the Constitution, end quote, Foreign Service officers generally felt alienated and demoralized. They were also sidelined. In a typical administration, at least one of the 5 undersecretary positions and the majority of the 23 assistant secretary positions are held by senior Foreign Service officers. Toward the end of the Trump administration, there was none, not a single senior Foreign Service officer in any of those positions. Similarly, ambassadorships are typically 70% for career officers and 30% for political appointees. But under President Trump, only 56% went to the Foreign Service, the smallest percentage since World War II. With the election of President Biden, American diplomats are cautiously optimistic that the Foreign Service role, as prescribed in the Foreign Service Act, will be resuscitated. They are optimistic because of his promises, but cautious because of 30 years of compounded damage by politicians. Candidate Biden stated, I will elevate diplomacy as the principal tool of foreign policy. I will reinvest in the diplomatic corps, which this administration has hollowed out, and put US diplomacy back in the hands of genuine professionals. This he has done by appointing well-regarded foreign affairs experts, including some Foreign Service officers, to lead the State Department and also the CIA and USAID. This he has done I'm sorry. Nevertheless, despite these appointments, he has already been criticized for doing this, for doing too little for the Foreign Service, because none of the, in a column in Business Insider last week, the opinion was expressed that Biden is blowing his best chance to inspire faith among American diplomats, because for the first time since 1993, one of the top 3 positions at the State Department did not go to a career official. The new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has been well received by the Foreign Service for promising to rebuild trust and morale, to be transparent, to encourage dissent, and to respect nonpartisanship. On his first day on the job last week, he declared, "All we ask is that you serve the United States, the Constitution, and the President to the best of your ability." Biden's and Blinken's intentions are laudable, but the crisis in American diplomacy is such that significant attention must be given to reforms and modernization in order to resurrect the Foreign Service's capacity to effectively serve our country. Bill Burns, the new CIA director, and Linda Thomas Greenfield, the new UN ambassador, both of whom are former senior Foreign Service officers, co-authored a few months ago an article entitled "The Transformation of Diplomacy: How to Save the State Department." Their assessment was, quote, "The wreckage at the State Department runs deep. And their remedy is," again quoting them, "not to restore the power and purpose of US diplomacy as it once was, but to reinvent it for a new era," end quote. This is also the view of former Secretary of State George Shultz, who advises rebuilding the State Department and its Foreign Service cannot simply mean replacing what was there in the Obama and Bush administrations and earlier administrations. There has been no shortage of reports in recent months on how this should be done, including one entitled "Revitalizing the State Department and American Diplomacy" from the Council on Foreign Relations, and another entitled "A U.S. Diplomatic Service for the 21st Century" from Harvard University. Many of their proposals are likely to be adopted, since some co-authors are now hold senior foreign policy positions in the Biden administration. Others may require legislation, including possibly a new Foreign Service Act to reflect changes of the past 40 years in the government and in the American workplace. Most of the recommendations address issues in the decline of American diplomacy that I have alluded to this evening. I will cite a few of them just to give you the flavor of what is proposed. They include revitalizing the role of the Foreign Service in making foreign policy, restoring the size of the Foreign Service by hiring 1,800 new personnel, expanding the Foreign Service by a further 15% to create a training float to improve diplomatic tradecraft, creating a mid-career employment program in areas of critical need, establishing a diplomatic reserve corps of 1,000 retirees to take a crisis, to have a crisis surge capacity, assigning more officers overseas, especially to thinly staffed posts, eliminating the 5 career cones or specializations to give officers broader experience and wider opportunities for promotion, focusing strongly on diversity in recruitment, assignments, and promotions to make those who represent America more representative of America. Making the Foreign Service less risk-averse by reducing constraints on the activities of officers outside of embassies, preserving the nonpartisan characteristic of the Foreign Service, and assigning Foreign Service officers to more senior positions in Washington and as ambassadors overseas, commensurate with numbers in prior administrations. Most of these proposals do come with a price tag, which would require Congress to do something that it has not done for many years, which is to actually approve a budget specifically for the State Department instead of chronically relying on inadequate continuing resolutions. This reality has been yet another factor in the crisis that I have discussed. The Foreign Service is resilient, and American diplomacy can be resurrected over time and with sustained commitment from our elected leaders. The Harvard University report summarizes nicely where we are today. It reads, "The Department of State remains a world-class diplomatic institution that employs thousands of thousands of the US government's most capable public servants. But left unaddressed, the challenges that the State Department faces risk causing irreparable damage to America's standing and influence in the world, ability to advance its interests overseas, and security and prosperity at home. Prioritizing reform, even in the face of competing demands, is among the most essential contributions that could be made to American security and prosperity, and is essential for equipping American diplomacy for the issues that the country faces," end quote. I shall end with that conclusion, except to add that Harvard, after much study, does have a cost-free recommendation to answer the Foreign Legion or the Forestry Service question. And that is to change the name of the Foreign Service to the United States Diplomatic Service. On that note, I thank you for your attention. I invite any pertinent questions or comments that you may have.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if someone wants to ask one, you can raise your hand. We'll recognize you. Yes, Francine.
Thank you for the presentation. I hear your frustration. Knowing the numbers that they need to even begin to get up to snuff, do you think it's appropriate that because of security clearances and other things that are involved, that they might look to within DIA, Pentagon, some of the higher levels there to fill some of the slots to try and move some of this, because those people at least are starting with clearances?
That certainly is a possibility. It already happens to some extent. For example, after I retired, I received a phone call from the State Department. Would you please go to Malawi and be an advisor to the president of Malawi, which I thought was an interesting way to spend our taxpayers' money. And when I got there, the American ambassador with whom I was working closely was actually a retired colonel from the US Army, as was her husband. They had done a lateral entry into the Foreign Service, which is not usual, but it is possible for it to happen. So there is a strong interest in trying to figure out how to have capable people come in mid-career, particularly in specialized areas where the State Department might be short on expertise, such as pandemic diplomacy, climate diplomacy, arms control, and some of these areas. There will undoubtedly be some opposition from within the Foreign Service, because people coming in at mid-level will be competing for promotions with people who have already been there for a number of years. So those personal issues do get involved. But one of the reasons for looking at mid-career entry is simply that there are so many vacancies. It takes so much time to recruit and train and provide experience to a new person that if we're going to restore our capabilities quickly, we have to look beyond the traditional mechanisms.
Andrea?
Hi, Tom. This is Andrea Sedano. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I actually have a more personal question, which is, when you were in your various assignments, how did you go about developing relationships, and what were the challenges of getting involved in whatever country you were in to actually affect change?
Well, we were very fortunate, certainly in my years, because the United States was so respected as a pillar of democracy, freedom, and human rights. So a lot of people were simply attracted to us. And indeed, you had to be careful in discerning who was trying to use you and who was trying to genuinely work with you.
Somebody else.
But that is, it's something that you acquire. I had the good fortune of serving in the Peace Corps. And people who serve in the Peace Corps now are a large percentage, as are people who serve in the military and other overseas organizations. A lot of experience in dealing and living in foreign culture. So having cross-cultural understanding is huge, developing relationships with people. And then you have to reach out and develop relationships at all levels. You have to develop relationships with influential people in power. At the same time, you know that people in power are there temporarily, and you have to try to be looking at successor generation. And then for the long term, you really have to have a lot of youth activities and contacts to have those relationships. And one of my favorite newscasters on TV is Frederica Whitfield. And one of the reasons for that is her father, Mal Whitfield, used to work for me in Somalia. Mal Whitfield won gold medals in the 1952 and 56 Olympics, as one of the fastest guys in the world. And we had him out in East Africa, coordinating, bringing over American basketball coaches and tennis coaches and track coaches and colleges recruiting Somalis and Kenyans and Ugandans to go to the United States to study and be American, be athletes. So you do it at all levels, and you have to be very conscious of doing that. If you confine yourself to people in power, you miss the underlining ripples in the society.
Tom, did you have any specific language capabilities?
Sure, I spoke Creole in Sierra Leone, but that really doesn't get you very far unless you eventually become the American ambassador to Sierra Leone. But you, in order to be tenured, as they call it in the Foreign Service, in other words, to be permanently employed as an officer, you have to be fluent in one language, and my language was French. But to get into the senior Foreign Service, you have to have a second language. And so I spent 11 months together with my wife, the two of us in a classroom, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, doing nothing but working on Czech with our tutor. And let me tell you, if anything tests a marriage, it's 11 months in a classroom all day long with your wife, trying to learn Czech. I also didn't drink a lot of coffee before that experience, but that made me a coffee drinker.
Thank you.
But it paid off. You know, I had the good fortune of being in Prague during the Velvet Revolution. I was there under communism. I was there for the overthrow of communism. I knew all the dissidents. Czech language sure helped a lot if you're dealing with Václav Havel and all those kinds of people. But again, those people, the dissidents, for example, are already well attracted to the United States. So we had generations of Foreign Service officers who had worked since the 1950s trying to bring down communism. And those of us who were there got all the credit, but the real credit really goes to all the generations of Foreign Service officers, one after another, who developed these relationships.
Tom, there was a question from, I think it was Bob Phelps, who wanted to know that you outlined several steps to improve our diplomacy across the world. Which one do you see as the most important?
Well, it's hard to say that there is one specifically. You really need a combination of actions at this point because the difficulties are so substantial. Certainly, we need to increase our presence. Certainly, we need to be there and we need to have the knowledge. Foreign Service generalists are exactly that, jacks of all trade. We try to be masters of some, but you really need more specialists as well on specific areas. And we really are in competition, especially with the Chinese. The Chinese are incredibly impressive. I've known lots of Chinese diplomats. I've had lots of wonderful Chinese food at their houses. They have a great system. Their ambassadors are allowed to bring chefs from China to work for them. But the Chinese are very, very good. Their diplomats are extremely well trained. They're very sophisticated. They're very savvy about what they're doing. And we used to say, well, the Chinese have to get up to our level, but I think in many respects, we have to get up to the level of the Chinese. And a lot of that means we have to redevelop our credibility, first of all, with our allies, and then secondarily with the rest of the world.
No more questions. Thank you. Tom, how would you assess the impact of the Peace Corps in the places that you served? Or on a broader level even.
Well, I'm biased because I found my wife in the Peace Corps, but the Peace Corps has enormous impact. It's an enormous asset that we have and other countries do not have very much of. The Canadians have a program called QSO. The British have their volunteers, but most countries do not. The French have always had some corporals who worked in schools and in government places. But we have always lived in the Peace Corps at the grassroots with people. And people really appreciate that individuals are willing to come from very developed countries where they would like to emigrate to, and we're ready to go there and live with them at their level. And change does not come dramatically, as we have seen. The Peace Corps has been in business for 60 years almost, and the impact, is limited. But you can change the world one person at a time, one school at a time, or one community at a time. And it does make a significant impact to that degree. But there are three objectives of the Peace Corps, and one of those has to do with strengthening America's understanding of foreign countries. And that, it seems to me, is one of the greatest values, hidden values almost, that it has had, and that we have such a large number, not only of diplomats, but of ambassadors and other people who have originated their experience in the Peace Corps, that otherwise they might not have taken them on a path to foreign affairs. I would say too, the Peace Corps, on a 24, 48-hour notice, it had to vacate from all countries in the world due to last February, I guess, due to the pandemic. And so the Peace Corps is shut down at the moment everywhere in the world. A new Peace Corps director has just been appointed by President Biden, and it's being staffed up again. And they're hoping to launch again this summer. But we'll see what happens. But it has been affected by the pandemic like everything else.
I remember seeing that. Thank you.
Kelsey, you have a question?
Hi, yes. You talked a little bit about working with the younger generations and getting the younger generations into the foreign service as older generations make the transition. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means to get people interested at a younger level, to view the foreign service as a career and things like that?
Sure. I think mostly it's been internships. For example, when I was running the American Embassy in Ethiopia, we always had a few interns in the embassy, usually college students or graduate students who wanted to learn something about the Foreign Service. There is a process in the State Department for doing that, but it's a raw deal in some ways because the State Department will not pay your airfare to get there. So you have to have the resources to go do that. But people in the embassy community reach out to people, and the embassy provides housing and that sort of thing and gives the person a stipend. But there are also funded internships, congressional fellows type programs where people can go and do that. People can also work as interns in the State Department itself. And if you go on the State Department website, you can find more information about that. Just as Foreign Service officers, when they come back to Washington, they don't all go work in the State Department. Some get detailed to congressional offices so they can learn about Congress, and members of Congress can learn about the Foreign Service. Some get detailed to other exchanges with other government agencies. So you'll find people from the military working in the State Department. You will find people from the intelligence agencies working in the State Department, and so forth. And as I mentioned earlier, the Foreign Service, there are about outside the State Department, there are about 1,500 USAID, Agency for International Development, Foreign Service officers in that agency. And there are about 200 in the Department of Commerce who are spread in about 75 embassies around the world to help facilitate American business. And we have another 50 or 60 Department of Agriculture folks in embassies, one looking at possible markets for American produce, but also they ensure that agricultural exports to the United States are properly handled so they will pass health requirements when they reach the United States.
Felix, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Tom. That was really interesting. And there's one of your points I had a question about. You mentioned continuing education as an important, as a way of improving the Foreign Service as it is. What do you see as being part of that education? How is it different than the current system or lack
thereof? Well, we do actually have a Center for National Training in Arlington, Virginia, named after George Shultz. And what a lot of it is training in foreign languages, an awful lot of Foreign Service language training. But there is some training for specific functions, such as an ambassadorial course for ambassadors, which political appointees especially need to have. And there are types of courses such as for people going to South Asia for the first time or going to Latin America for the first time. They have this kind of regional training. But it's very short and it could be have much more depth if there wasn't such a demand to have people get where they're going as quickly as possible. I think the type that they're really looking at is more what they call tradecraft training, how to actually hone your diplomatic skills in the area in which you'll be working in a country. There are also some opportunities to go do graduate work, but very, very few of those. And we also have what are known as diplomats in residence at in various parts of the country at universities. For example, at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy, we have an American diplomat serving there, reaching out, trying to recruit, doing among other things, trying to recruit college students to apply to the Foreign Service and to advise them on the types of studies that would be helpful in passing the examinations. It's interesting, when I passed the Foreign Service exam, people said, well, read the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time and Newsweek every week, and you'll do fine. Nowadays, of course, everything is online. And beyond that, there are even cliff notes on how to pass the exam. But it is challenging. But to go back to your question, I'd say the greatest focus in the continuing education would be making people available to take those tradecraft courses, because now, and also for people to be given real credit for undertaking that longer term training, because now your promotion prospects in the Foreign Service are actually diminished when you spend time getting trained instead of actually doing your job. And I think it's the reverse in the military to some extent, but in the Foreign Service, at the moment, it's a negative and it needs to be turned into a positive.
Makes sense. Thank you for your answer.
All right, that's true.
Tom from Becky Myers. She said, Tom, it sounds like a fascinating career, giving you incredible perspective on the world and US government. When you look back, I would be interested in hearing what you believe was the most gratifying post you held or contribution that you made, and why.
Well, that sounds like an exam in the oral exam of the Foreign Service. I have a lot of them, actually. It's everyone. I mean, I loved every assignment I have. I loved every country I worked in, and I worked with fantastic people, some very unexpected people, and had incredible moments. You know, who would have thought at 6 a.m. in Prague, you would be spending your time one-on-one with Newt Gingrich, walking him around the streets of Prague to explain the history of the town, or that you would be sitting in Ethiopia, having breakfast and lunch and all morning with George McGovern talking about Tom Eagleton and the election. There are all those sorts of contacts. Or, you know, having Nelson Mandela pull me over and say, why don't you ever have your picture taken with me? You come to my house all the time. There are things like that, and they're fantastic. I would say that the one post that was the most exciting, most certainly, was being in Prague, living through everything that happened before the fall of communism, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and everything that happened ever afterwards, and working closely with the new government there to make sure that democracy would succeed. But I also took a lot of gratification working in South Africa in the 1970s under apartheid, and trying to work toward bringing blacks and whites together to try and find a peaceful rather than a violent solution to end apartheid. And then there was gratification when I headed Africa in the United States Information Service, and then went to serve in South Africa to work closely with the president's office there in trying to make sure that the post-apartheid government would succeed. I think the most frustrating time, and to some degree, was in a wonderful country, Ethiopia, where I was for much of the time charge d'affaires. That means person in charge of the embassy in the absence of an ambassador, trying to persuade Prime Minister Melish to make peace with Eritrea. There was a peace accord in place. We really had to work at doing that. And some other things. We have lots of visitors from Washington, all sorts of interesting groups. And we had a really interesting time that I had to take to see Prime Minister Mellish. And that was our Secretary of Treasury, who was a fairly dour and conservative person, who brought with him Chris Rock and Bono. And I had to haul the three of them around, seeing the Prime Minister, but just had lots of fun. Chris Rock was amazing fun, and all the kids, when we went to visit a school, knew exactly who he was from DVDs that they'd seen. And Bono, of course, everybody knew for his music. So it was just a fun time. And, you have certain emotional, moving moments in countries. And in Addis Ababa, I had a little kid that kept pestering me because he knew I worked with the embassy, and he said, he must have been 9 years old, 8 years old. He said, I want to meet Bono. I want to meet Bono. I said, okay, kid, I'll do what I can. And we have 3 days to do this. So finally we get to the last day, and Bono's about to get in his limousine, and the kid is over there. And I say, excuse me, Bono, but would you mind just saying hi to this kid? Because he really, really loves your music and stuff. I always said, oh, sure. And he went over, he not only said hi to the kid, he took off his sunglasses, which were his signature in a sense, and gave them to the kid. And the kid was absolutely thrilled. And that's those emotional moments that really get you. In Prague, though, it's certainly I had a couple of really interesting things. One was setting up a lunch. I worked for Shirley Temple Black. She was the ambassador, and she said, hey, Tom, I hear that, what's his name? It was Catherine Graham and who's the antithesis of Catherine Graham? Not Murchison, Rupert Murdoch. Sorry, Rupert Murdoch. She said, oh, Rupert Murdoch's coming to town. Would you please invite him to lunch?
Tom, I have a question from Alice Robinson.
Let me just answer that one. Rupert Murdoch said, she said, well, call Rupert Murdoch. I said, I don't have his phone number. Well, I've tracked down Rupert Murdoch in London, called his office, and figured I would talk to his secretary. And instead, she said, oh, let me give you to Rupert. So next thing I know, I'm talking to Rupert Murdoch, and I said, can you come to lunch? And he said, sure. So I go back and tell the ambassador. He says, great. I just heard Catherine Graham's going to be in town. Let's have them to lunch together. So then I had to call the Washington Post, and I thought I'd get the secretary again. They said, oh, she's working in her greenhouse today. Let us put you through. So I ended up talking to Catherine Graham, and she said, oh, sure, love to. And we had this fantastic lunch. And then just one final story. That was very emotional one. A lady came to my office, and since I was in charge of public affairs, I was sort of the gatekeeper for people who wanted to see Ambassador Black. And somebody said, this person really has a story you have to hear. So this woman came in to see me with her friend, and she explained that when she was a little Jewish girl in Prague, she and her family were grabbed by the Nazis and taken to Theresienstadt, which was the concentration camp near Prague. And all she was able to grab to take with her were her Shirley Temple doll and her little book about one of Shirley Temple's movies. And during the course of the war, all of her family was separated. All of her family died in the concentration camps, but she survived. And all she was left with when she emerged was her Shirley Temple book. And all her life, she wanted to meet Shirley Temple. And could I arrange it? So I went over and I saw the ambassador. I said, here's the story. And she said, well, of course. And we had the most emotional moment between this woman who had Shirley Temple as the one continuity in her life, and the ambassador herself, who had fans all over the world, but wanted to be seen as an adult, not a child, and therefore spent little time with people except on these special occasions. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short question and maybe not a total answer. And Mary, you have one other questioner?
No, Tom, yeah, I think we'll have to make it our last question because of time. But Ellis Robinson has a question. Alice, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. I was just, first of all, thank you very much for such a fascinating conversation. I just came from a visit with 4 different Peace Corps volunteers, and so it was wonderful to hear about your experiences too. I just, one of the things that we keep talking about is diplomacy as a medium of building peace. And I wondered, as you look at the State Department, the diplomatic corps going forward, what do you think would be the best way of focusing that energy? Where can we make the biggest change?
In the terms of the State Department or in terms of
the diplomatic corps?
Well, in the diplomatic corps, I think it's concentration on the really important issues of our time. And, a lot of you're always torn between the importance of the long-term issues, such as climate change, and the immediate issues of our pandemic, for example, or but most of these are both long and short term, just like arms control. And so it's hard to focus, say one particular area. There's so many balls in the air. And global poverty is one that just doesn't get addressed a lot because it's so intractable. But yet, as long as we have 2 worlds, one's extremely developed and one extremely poor, we're always going to have instability in the world. We saw that with all the terrorism earlier in this century. And that even though that terrorism has subsided quite a bit, the root causes are very much still there. And they are basically, in my mind, problems of poverty, of people being dispossessed and being marginalized. So that's where I would really like to see a lot of attention.
Well, I'd like to thank Tom for giving us all this time tonight and thank everybody for coming to Center Presents. And I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you, Tom. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
My
Great.
pleasure.
Good job, Opa.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye.